The U.S. Presidential Special Envoy for Climate Change, John Kerry, has finished his trip to China. According to the joint statement, the two countries have reached a consensus on key areas for future operation on climate issues. But can the Chinese Communist regime become carbon neutral by 2060? What's the hidden agenda behind the climate change issues for both sides? Welcome to KSJ Bridging the Gap. This is Sarah. Before we go on with this episode, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment, and turn on the notification bell. Climate change or global warming is one of the hottest topics in public discourse today. Yet we were more familiar with the phrase air pollution before. Many Chinese people may still remember the report by Chai Jing, Under the Dome.
它的大部分从哪儿来？这就是结论。中国的 PM2.5%60%来自于燃煤和燃油，也就是化石能源的燃烧。这种燃烧的强度有多大呢？我们可以来看看，在2014年，这个数值可以代表全球化石能源燃烧的燃烧强度。你可以看看中国有多亮，那个烧的发红、发亮、发白的地方，就是我们国家。从图标来看的话，它比欧洲高出3到4倍。我们烧了这么多化石能源，而最让我感到意外的是，煤和油的污染物之间可以发生大规模的化学反应。全世界都要烧煤和油，对吗？我们的煤怎么了？你们知道中国烧了多少煤吗？2013年的时候，我们已经是36亿吨了。但你知道全世界其他国家烧了多少煤吗？我们比全世界所有其他国家加起来烧的煤还要多。
Chai Jing said air pollution was leading to 1 million premature deaths in China alone every year. Chai Jing's report led to environmental awakening among Chinese people, although it was banned soon. Chinese people started to realize how serious the pollution was in China, and they got to know a new term called PM 2.5, which was considered a very politically sensitive phrase because the PM 2.5 levels in China were 5 to 10 times higher than World Health Organization guidelines. PM 2.5 refers to air particulates with a diameter of 2.5 microns or less, which have serious health implications. They are small enough to penetrate human lung tissue, and they can cause asthma, lung cancer, and cardiovascular disease. In most parts of China, PM 2.5 had been found to account for more than half of air particulate pollution. However, national air quality standards in China had lacked requirements for monitoring PM 2.5 or specific reduction targets until recent years. A few years later, Chinese people feel that air quality is improving, but remains a big concern. Early this month, widespread sandstorms pelted the capital and spread as far as central China for many days, indicating the big environmental challenges China is still facing. China is the world's biggest coal user and carbon emitter, pumping out nearly 30% of the world's fossil fuel fumes. Last year alone, 73 gigawatts of new coal-fired power plant capacity were put into operation throughout China, 3 times more than in the rest of the world combined. In addition, in the last decade, China had invested in more than 240 coal-fired power plants in more than 68 countries affiliated with the One Belt, One Road initiative, according to data in 2018. That means even though China is cleaning up at home, it is exporting some of that pollution to other countries. China is not only generating huge carbon emissions, but also locking other countries into decades of carbon-intensive growth. Thus, China is playing a big role in the overall environment status on the planet. Air pollution in China is causing health problems to its own people as well as threatening the whole world. This pure environmental issue, however, has been made use of by globalists for climate change and global warming in the past decade. Although propaganda has allowed the public to form a consensus on global warming, what is rarely known is that climate warming has not reached a consensus in the scientific community. The issues hotly debated by scientists include whether environmental warming is caused primarily by human activity or by natural factors, how warm the world will be by the end of the 21st century, whether humans even have the ability to predict how the climate will change in the future, and whether there is an impending ecological disaster. The globalists promote aggressively the climate change agenda, from green stimulus, clean energy plans, to the Paris Climate Accord, with celebrities, media personalities, politicians, and members of the general public weighing in. That is essentially different from the idea of purely protecting the environment. The latter has nothing to do with politics, while what they are doing is a political and communist ideological movement in the name of environmental protection. China, the largest polluter of the world, inevitably becomes a very important part of their agenda. Yet the Chinese Communist Party does not even care about its own people, with over 80 million people killed under its control. As long as it could fool the people and maintain the legitimacy of the regime, the CCP won't deal with the environmental problem seriously, because the solution costs too much and it hampers the economic growth and development in the country. Therefore, the CCP had never agreed to make international commitments until in 2014, Xi Jinping signed a first-ever climate agreement with the US President Obama, which became an important part of the Paris Climate Accord. China pledged that it would reach peak carbon emissions by 2030 and that the so-called clean energy sources like solar power and windmills would account for 20% of China's total energy production by 2030. But the CCP refused to make long-term commitments. In 2017, President Trump announced his intention to leave the deal, saying that letting countries such as China and India use fossil fuels while the US had to curb its carbon was unfair. The withdrawal became official on November 4, 2020. The US withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord created the vacuum of influence that the CCP considered as an opportunity to fill up and gain international leadership on climate issues. Thus, Xi Jinping announced last September at the United Nations General Assembly that China would be carbon neutral by 2060.
采取更加有力的政策和措施，二氧化碳排放力争于2030年前达到峰值，努力争取2060年前实现碳中和。
With this goal, the CCP is working with the EU to push for greater convergence of taxonomies of green finance and investments. Yi Gang, the governor of the People's Bank of China, said at the China Development Forum in March that the primary goal of the central bank over the next 5 years was to implement and standardize a green finance system in the country in coordination with global partners. The cooperation between the People's Bank of China and the EU goes beyond the scope of climate change issues, which exposes Xi Jinping's ambition to lead the world. In March, Beijing pledged to reduce carbon emissions per unit of economic output by 18% over the next 5 years, in line with its goals for the previous 5-year period. But experts said China needs to reduce by 50% in the next 10 years in order to reach a peak by 2030. Can Beijing fulfill its promise by 2030 and 2060 then? China's economy growth has resulted in enormous increases in its carbon footprint, and it continues to do so. Based on its 14th five-year plan outline, the highest-level policy launched by the CCP in March, it keeps promoting the exploration and development of oil and gas resources and base construction. In foreign investment, especially the Belt and Road Initiative, the CCP is still vigorously building new coal-fired generation plants. So the CCP's most recent plan suggests that relying on the CCP commitment on the climate is questionable. But Biden seems to have fallen into the CCP's trap. Hours after he was sworn in, Biden announced the U.S. plans to re-enter the Paris Climate Accord in a sign of Biden's urgency to address the climate change issue. It is not hard to understand. In an exclusive interview with Meet the Press, Joe Biden talked about his race for the Democratic nomination, and he said, "I would be most progressive president in history." By re-entering the Paris Climate Accord and sending John Kerry as his special envoy to China, Biden is fulfilling part of his vow to become the most progressive president. That's the Biden agenda. John Kerry reached an agreement with Xie Zhenhua, his Chinese counterpart, during 2 days of talks in Shanghai. Kerry is the highest-level U.S. officials to travel to China since Biden took office in January. Xie Zhenhua, the latest climate envoy appointed by Xi Jinping, has been known for years of refusing to assume responsibility for carbon emissions. He knocked on the table at the Durban Climate Change Conference in 2011, rejected an attempt to impose a carbon emission target on the CCP from the standpoint of a developing country, asking the developed countries to agree to a legally binding agreement to cut emissions while China and other developing countries could get away with weaker commitments. The CCP's mouthpiece, CCTV, reported that a major accomplishment of the Sino-US talks last week was restarting the dialogue and cooperation between China and the United States on climate change issues. Obviously, the CCP's attitude this time is completely different from that at the Alaska talks months ago. The CCP has long described itself as a victim of foreign aggression in what Yang Jiechi termed the century of humiliation when he was playing like a wolf warrior. The narrative of victimhood has served the Chinese regime well in its diplomatic strategies to gain benefits from other countries, as well as Beijing's justification for conditional acceptance and selective modification of the existing rules-based order. Ironically, at the same time, the CCP is seeking to be treated as an equal by the United States. Xi Jinping hasn't yet accepted Biden's invitation to the 40-country virtual summit to be held this week. But during a video meeting with German and French leaders, Xi said climate change should not become a geopolitical chip, a target for attacking other countries, or an excuse for trade barriers. Though he called for close cooperation on the issue, according to Xinhua, China's official news agency. That statement serves better for the CCP. In fact, Xi Jinping's climate strategy reveals that the CCP's plan is not to cooperate, but to fight for hegemony with the United States and rewrite the international rules. KSJ, Bridging the Gap. See you next time.